The Cittadella, also known as the Citadel, the Castello at the Gran Castello, is a citadel in Victoria, on the island of Gozo in Malta. The area has been inhabited since the Bronze Age. The present configuration of the Cittadella is a combination of a medieval castle and an early modern gunpowder fortress, with its northern walls retaining a largely medieval form and its southern walls dating back to a 17th century reconstruction. The Cittadella has been included on Malta's tentative list of UNESCO World Heritage Sites since 1998. History, Prehistory and Antiquity. Although there is only limited evidence of Neolithic remains in the Cittadella of Victoria, it is likely that the area has been inhabited since the Stone Age given its size and strategic position. Archaeological remains show that the site of the Cittadella was definitely inhabited during the Bronze Age. In the Tarxan Cemetery and Borgin-Nardua phases of Maltese prehistory, the Victoria area remained the main settlement on Gozo throughout the Phoenician and Roman periods, and it became a settlement known as Gaulis Igloconis Civitas. The city consisted of a necropolis on the site of the Cittadella and a fortified town in an area now occupied by part of Victoria. A temple dedicated to Juno is said to have stood on the site now occupied by the cathedral. A number of architectural fragments from Gaulis have survived. Medieval period. During the medieval period, the Roman town was abandoned, and the Acropolis was transformed into a castle. The first reference to the castrum of Gozo dates back to 1241. It was sacked by the Genoese in 1274, and a report on its fortifications was ordered 2 years later. At this point, 1/3 of Gozo's population lived in or around the Cittadella, and the island's inhabitants were required to spend the night within the citadel. By the end of the 13th century, the Cittadella housed some Sicilian or Italian noblemen representing the Count of Malta. The Cittadella was called Terra by the mid-14th century, and an administrative council known as the Università was founded in 1350. Over time, the Cittadella became too small for the growing population, and by the 15th century the suburb of Rabat began to develop on the site of the Roman town. This settlement was surrounded by a wall with 3 gates known as Putir-Ejal, Bibil-Ghajn and Bibil-Gab. At this point Malta and Gozo were ruled by the Crown of Aragon, and the Cittadella's fortifications were strengthened. Hospitaller rule. Malta and Gozo were handed over to the Order of St. John in 1530. At the time, the Cittadella was still a medieval castle which provided refuge for the Gozotans during Ottoman Barbary attacks. The largest attack on the Cittadella took place in July 1551, when a large Ottoman force led by Admiral Sinar Pasha invaded Gozo and besieged the Cittadella. Governor Xwejnusgozo offered terms of surrender, but they were refused and the castle fell within a matter of days. It was sacked and most of the 6,000 Gozotans who took refuge there were taken as slaves. The attack left the castle as a ruin and it was rebuilt soon afterwards, although initially no efforts were made to modernize it. The Cittadella was not attacked during the Great Siege of Malta in 1565. Although there had been proposals to demolish the castle and evacuate its inhabitants to Sicily, the castle served an important role during the siege, as it maintained a communication link between besieged Burgu and Christian vessels, and it also reported Ottoman movements to the order. After the siege, Grand Master Jean Parasot de Valet and military engineer Francesco Laparelli visited the Cittadella in order to modernize it, but nothing materialized since at the time the order was busy constructing its new capital Valletta on mainland Malta. The Cittadella was attacked again by corsairs in 1583. In 1599, a major reconstruction of the Cittadella began to designs of the military engineer Giovanni Rinaldini and under the direction of Vittorio Cassa. The southern walls of the city were completely rebuilt as a bastion enceinte with a single bastion and two demi-bastions linked by curtain walls, along with two cavaliers, a ditch and outworks. Parts of the northern walls were also rebuilt by the Hospitallers, although they retained a medieval form. The walls surrounding the suburb Rabat were probably demolished at this point. The reconstruction to Rinaldini's and Cassa's designs was completed in around 1622. Gozo's population stayed within the walls of the Cittadella between dusk and dawn until this curfew was lifted on the 15th of April 1637. The castle remained the only fortified refuge against attack for the island's inhabitants until Fort Chambray was built in the mid-18th century. Soon after the reconstruction was complete, the Cittadella's defences were again criticized. In the 1640s, plans were made to demolish the citadel and build a new fortress at Marsalforn. Mines were actually built under the bastions to destroy them if necessary, but the demolition was never done. The engineer Antonio Maurizio Valperga suggested to rebuild the wall around the suburb and further strengthen the Cittadella, but there were no funds for this proposal. By the early 18th century, the Cittadella had assumed the role of a fortress, with many of its houses falling into ruin or being in a poor state. An attack on Gozo took place in 1708, and in 1715, the engineer Louis-François d'Orbigny de Tinay made the same suggestions as Valperga, but a lack of funds prevented any work from being carried out. French occupation and British rule. In June 1798, the Maltese Islands were occupied by the French, but the Maltese revolted after a couple of months of French rule. The Gozitans rebelled on the 3rd of September, and the French garrison withdrew to the Cittadella, until they capitulated on the 28th of October after some negotiations. A day later, the British transferred control of the Cittadella to the Gozitans, who set up a provisional government led by Francesco Saverio Cassa and briefly administered the island as the independent state La Nazione Gozitana. The fortifications of the Cittadella were decommissioned by the British on the 1st of April 1868. The Cittadella's fortifications and the ruined buildings within the city were included on the Antiquities list of 1925. Several World War II-era air raid shelters were dug within the Cittadella. Recent history. The Cittadella's fortifications, including part of the medieval enceinte, are intact. The southern part of the city, where the cathedral and other buildings are located, is also in good condition, but the northern part is largely in ruins. Many of these ruins date back to the medieval period, and they contain archaeological deposits. In 2006, the first plans were made to restore the Cittadella, as part of a project that also includes the restoration of the fortifications of Valletta, Birgu and Imdina on mainland Malta. Restoration began in 2008 and is ongoing. Throughout the course of restoration, various architectural features and archaeological remains have been unearthed, including the city's original entrance. Architecture. The Cittadella is built on a promontory overlooking the present-day city of Victoria. This location was originally chosen because it is a naturally defensible hill, dominating the surrounding countryside and having views of large parts of the coastline. Fortifications. The fortifications of the Cittadella consist of a semicircular enceinte in the northern end of the city, and bastions linked together with curtain walls in the south. The northern walls are built on the perimeter of the natural plateau, so they were difficult to attack. They were originally built in the 15th century, although large portions of the walls were rebuilt by the Hospitallers or in modern times. The northern walls include the remains of a collapsed medieval wall tower, a blocked-up sally port, a lookout post and some walled-up windows. Masonry revetments are built in depressions within the cliff face below the northern walls. The southern perimeter of the city consists of a 17th-century bastion encinta which was built by the Hospitallers. A large arrowhead-shaped bastion known as St. Michael's Bastion is built at the southernmost end of the city, while two demi-bastions, St. Martin's and St. John's demi-bastions, are located at the west and east ends of the city. Flat-roofed accorgets are built on the salient of each demi-bastion. St. Michael's Bastion also had an accorget, but this was replaced by a clock tower in 1858. A small gunpowder magazine is located at the junction between St. John's demi-bastion and the medieval encinta. The bastions are linked together by curtain walls. The one between St. Martin's demi-bastion and St. Michael's Bastion contains the main gate, a modern arched opening and a clock tower. The wall between St. Michael's Bastion and St. John's demi-bastion is known as St. Philip's Curtain, and its upper part contains slit-like openings which open into a series of magazines which are now used as craft shops. These rooms support a walkway along the ramparts. Cavaliers were also built close to each demi-bastion. St. Martin's Cavalier is located between the medieval encinta and St. Martin's demi-bastion, and it is only partially intact, its upper portions having been pulled down. St. John's Cavalier, which is found near St. John's demi-bastion in the rear of the cathedral, was completed in 1614. A freestanding room was constructed on its roof in 1701 for use as a gunpowder magazine. A pentagonal artillery battery known as the Low Battery is grafted below the walls at the easternmost extremity of the fortress, close to St. John's demi-bastion. The southern perimeter of the Cittadella is surrounded by a ditch, which originally extended from St. Martin's demi-bastion to the Low Battery but now begins at St. Michael's Bastion due to 19th-century alterations. A covered way with a single place of arms runs along the ditch. A steep glacis was located outside the covered way, but this has been built up. A small triangular ravelin stood near the entrance to the city, but this has lost most of its stonework and has been converted into a garden, losing its legibility as part of the fortress in the process. Other buildings. A number of notable buildings are located within the walls of the Cittadella. These include Cathedral of the Assumption, a Baroque cathedral which houses the Roman Catholic Diocese of Gozo. It was built between 1697 and 1711 by Lorenzo Gaffa, a Maltese architect who also built the Cathedral of Mdina. It is said that it lies on the site where a Roman temple dedicated to Juno once stood. It is most famous for the remarkable trompe-l'oeil painting on its ceiling, which depicts the interior of a dome that was never built. Chapel of St. Joseph, a chapel built in 1625 on the site of an 11th-century chapel. Chapel of St. Barbara within the walls, a chapel built in the early 17th century. Courts of Justice, law courts housed in the former Governor's Palace, which was built in the early 16th century. Old Prison, a former prison used between the 16th century and 1962, that is now open to the public as a museum. Gozo Museum of Archaeology, a museum dedicated to Gozotan history, from the prehistoric to medieval periods. Natural Science Museum, a museum dedicated to Gozo's geography, geology and natural science. Gran Castello Historic House, a museum dedicated to Gozotan folklore housed in a cluster of early 16th century houses.